You see the slide I'm showing now?
Yeah. Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your attendance. And my name is Bingru Zhao. I'm from Bangor Business School in the UK. And today I'm going to present one of my working papers, which is entitled Firm ESG Reputation Risk and Debt Choice. And this paper is a joint work co-authored with Professor David Newton and Dr. Rusche from University of Bath and Professor Stephen Ogina from University of Zurich. And previously, this paper was entitled "The Banks versus Market: Are Banks More Effectively Facilitate Sustainability?" And now we change the topic of the title of this paper. Now the new title is "A Firm ESG Reputation Risk and Debt Choice." Let me introduce the motivation of this paper. As you know, ESG risk and sustainable development have been widely discussed in the business world and have been incorporated into firms' behaviors. Banks and institutional investors play a key role in the transition to a low-carbon sustainable economy by funding and supporting environmentally and socially responsible projects and enterprises. According to data from United Nations in 2020, over 250 banks representing over 40% of global banking assets have now committed to align with the vision society has set out for its future in the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. However, the significance of the different types of debt in shaping sustainable transformation remains unknown. In other words, we don't know whether there's a different attitude towards ESG risk between the bank-based financing and the market-based financing. So our paper aims to fill this gap by investigating following questions. The first question, does firm's ESG reputation risk impact its financing choice? What could be the potential mechanism behind the choice? And which type of debt could effectively contribute to the sustainable transformation? So there are some potential mechanisms. From the demand side, there are two opposite views on the relationship between financing choices and the ESG risk. First, firms with higher ESG risk exposure could tend to voluntarily rely on bank loans to improve their ESG reputation while bank monitoring. Another potential mechanism is that firms with high ESG risk exposure tend to avoid bank monitoring by issuing public bonds because firms' ESG-related misbehaviors or risks can be easily detected by banks and shaped by banks. And another potential mechanism from the supply side, banks could shrink their loan supply or disrupt lending relationship to firms with high ESG risk exposure because lending to firms that have scandal is a negative shocks to banks' reputation, which leads to the depositor base volatility and outflow of deposits. So consequently, the contraction in the loan supply increases firms' reliance on public debt. Bond investors are willing to provide funding to high ESG firms due to diffusive bond holdings because there is a diversified ownership in the bond market. There is a free rider problem, so the bond investors are not willing to spend much cost or time on monitoring the firm's ESG performance. So they are less likely to be affected by firms' ESG negative shocks. So data source and sample construction. Our sample starts from 2007 to the end of 2020. Chemical IQ provides our debt structure level data, and RepRisk provides our ESG risk exposure data. And we acquire our company information from CompuStat. And Refinitiv, Aircon, LPC Steel-Scan, and SD jointly provide our loan level data and bond level data. So there are two levels of sample in our paper. In the sample of the debt structure level, we have 3,783 US public firms, including the 71,341 firm year quarter observations from 2007 to the end of the 2020. And we excluded all financial firms and observations with missing firms and financial information. So in the sample of known deal and bond deal level, we have 14,383 known facilities and 5,569 public bonds. So this is a very simple empirical setting, and this is our baseline estimation model. The Y, the dependent variable, is a debt choice measure, which captures the firm's reliance on back debt or bond debt. It's proxied by either a proportion of the back debt in a firm's total debt or the proportion of the public debt in a firm's total debt. RRI is a ESG risk exposure provided by the rep risk, which captures the firm's ESG risk exposure at the end of the quarter prior to the period end date of debt structure. And we also include a set of control variables, include some many financial characteristics that may influence the choice of debt. This is our baseline result. And we can find that, okay, the ESG risk exposure proxied by the RRI is negatively associated with back debt and is positively associated with a public debt. And we find there is no impact, the ESG risk exposure has no impact on total debt. So which means the decline on back debt is compensated by the increase on public debt. And we also controlled the year quarter fixed effect, meaning control variables and industry fixed effect. And then we split our ESG risk exposure into three components: the environment component, social component, and governance component. And surprisingly, we find our results are mainly driven by social and governance factors, and not the environmental factor. And then we split our ESG risk exposure into 28 issues. And the result on this slide confirm the results on last slide, that our results are mainly driven by the social related the issues and governance related issues. And so what could be the potential mechanisms behind the firm's the less reliance on back debt? So if the back monitoring avoidance channel dominates our result, we could expect that firms with ESG risk exposure significantly reduce their reliance on terminals relative to revolvers. Why? Because terminals are normally issued to the firms with high risk and with stricter monitoring requirement. So in here, we find that firms with high ESG risk exposure significantly reduce their reliance on terminals relative to revolvers. So if the firms with high ESG risk exposure, they want to avoid back monitoring, the first step is to reduce their reliance on terminals. And according to Host and Shan, their IFS paper published in 2020, and they demonstrate that an amount of unfavorable ESG news item is adversely associated with the chance of maintaining the same lead arrangers, implying that reputation shocks may cause firms to switch lenders. The hypothesis of the disrupted lending relationship naturally raises a question of whether firms who have received more negative ESG-related news may shift away from back debt toward back public bond debt in reaction to the possibility of sudden termination of lending relationship. And we find that, so in this table, we find that with the increasing number of ESG negative news, we find the firm at the last quarter, the firms are less likely to issue new back loans and are more likely to issue a public bond at the next quarter. And we also find that with the increasing number of ESG news that firms are less likely to keep borrowing from back debt at the next quarter and are more likely to keep borrowing from the public bond market. And in Title B, we excluded the firms with, so the firms that issue both bonds at loans. The result is still robust and consistent with the result in Panel A. And we know that endogenous concern is a big problem in our paper, so we used the two-stage OS to alleviate this concern. And there are two instrumental variables. The first one is the Canada border. That is a dummy variable that is one if the firm's headquarters is located in the state that borders Canada and zero otherwise. And another instrumental variable is a dummy variable that equals one if the ratio of the religious adherents in the state where the firm's headquarters located is higher than 50%. And also we used the continuous variables. The result is still robust and consistent. So our result passed the two-stage OS. Robustness checks, and the first question is that whether our results are driven by some important potential omitted variables. So we used the Oster test, and we find that our results are not impacted by any potential omitted variables. And we also rely on, so another question is that whether our debt choice driven by the different ESG pricing in the loan market and bond market. So we rely on our loan and bond level sample constructed by Dilskan and SDC database. We find that the ESG reputation risk is priced in both loan contract and bond contract. We use the level of institutional ownership to proxy the degree of information asymmetry. We find our results are more pronounced when firms have a high level of institutional ownership. And also our results are still robust and consistent when we re-estimate our results based on the loan level and bond level samples. Also, our results are robust when control for firm fixed effect and use a different proxy to measure the firm's ESG risk performance. So conclusion, our results show that firms with high ESG risk exposure rely more on public bond rather than back debt as a way to avoid back monitoring. And also firms with high ESG risk exposure borrow less from banks probably for, so this is for avoiding back monitoring, which is reflected on the reduced reliance on term loans. And we also find that the firms suffering higher level of negative ESG news are less likely to continue to rely on back debt in response to the threat of disrupted lending relationship. And finally, so we find that the reliance on public bond market is more pronounced when firms with relatively lower adverse selection cost. So this is last slide. And if you have any suggestions or comments, just please let me know. I would be very happy to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll go directly to Roxandra, who's here from the EBA, who will provide the discussion.
I learned from my predecessors, so I'm not touching the laptop. Mm-hmm. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for the authors for this really eloquent paper. Thank you so much also for the organizers for having me today. Fully cognizant of the fact that I'm standing between you and the next cup of coffee, I will keep this short. First of all, as eloquently as the speaker has already put it, I will try and nonetheless do a quick recap of the paper. So first of all, the main questions of this paper are looking at whether firms with higher ESG risk exposure rely less on bank loans in order to avoid enhanced monitoring imposed by banks. And the second question would be whether firms with higher ESG reputation risk are more likely to switch from bank debt to public debt. The findings, which are a testimony to the heavy work that has been done by the authors in order to write this paper, are that, number one, overall debt levels are not impacted. And this is, I assume, notwithstanding the rising cost of debt in case of ESG challenged firms. High ESG reputation risk is negatively correlated with reliance on bank debt. And when ESG challenged firms switch to public debt, they prefer senior debt for long maturities and commercial paper for short maturities. In one notable result, the S&G part of the ESG drive the reduced reliance on bank debt, not so much the E component. And the more negative ESG related news for a firm, the more likely it is to switch from bank debt to public debt and to keep borrowing from the public bond market. First of all, it's a very pleasant read because the paper is very streamlined and very eloquent. It single-mindedly goes to demonstrate its baseline hypothesis. Nonetheless, it brings a fresh view and contributes to further understanding the ESG topic from the perspective of debtors. As you might well have understood, this session is about the triangle between debtors, firms, as in firms, and banks and the financial markets. This paper focuses on debtors and their choices in lending. The solid econometric toolkit and the comprehensive database are also very pleasant when going through the paper because there is not that much econometrics acrobatics. It's the database helps tell a story without the data being too tortured. Nonetheless, I think that there are a couple of elements that could be added or we could be a little bit more worked on in order to provide to contribute to concluding on a couple of policy implications, which would also transform this work into something that a banking regulator could use in the immediate term. So first of all, it would be interesting to understand whether structural change checks would change or maintain the results robust. For instance, it would be interesting to compare subsets of time periods. The full time of the full scale of the time period used is also coincides with has been very rich in terms of historical evolutions on the ESG topic, and there are a couple of moments that could have provided for structural breaks. So it would be interesting from a regulatory perspective to understand whether sub-period comparisons would maintain the results. And this is also something that could help us understand what are the next policy implications that we could derive from this. Another interesting question would be to see whether key findings still hold if we use a different set of ESG ratings. There's an extensive literature on how reliable ESG ratings are, but nonetheless, using the RepRisk database is a new database in this whole environment, and it would help to understand how reliable this new database is. As overall, as I said, because there is the policy implications lack, and I've said this over and over, and I feel this is the main point where this paper could be improved, because a little bit more of scene setting in terms of describing and understanding what are the characteristics of the firms that are involved, who are the banks that are involved in this, that are in this database, and understanding how the relationship between different types of banks and different types of debtors work would also help nuance the conclusions in terms of policy that we may take from this paper. So overall, a great paper that with a little bit of help could also become a very interesting and immediate regulatory product. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether you want to have a quick reaction on some of these things.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for discussing the comment and very helpful. I would like to answer some of the questions. For example, do the key findings still hold if different set of ESG ratings are used? So I think the answer is yes. We used the ESG data provided by the refinitiv Econ. We concluded a very similar result that the firms with high ESG, performance are significantly increase their reliance on back debt instead of public debt, because ESG risk exposure normally provides opposite result with the ESG performance, right? So the result is still robust and consistent when we use a different ESG provider. And the reason why we use the risk is because the debt structure level, the sample is a quarterly level. So the many other ESG rating provided by those providers, they are just the yearly level. So, but the risk provides an unbroken monthly ESG rate performance rating. So we aggregate the monthly level ESG data to the quarterly level. So this is the reason why we use the risk. And I also think about the regulatory change. Actually, in the US, they are far behind the EU in the ESG regulations. So we couldn't find any regulatory change on ESG in the US market. So this is the reason why we didn't have any, the result in this area. So that's all. Thank you very much for your comments. They're very helpful. And also, I think it's very interesting to see whether the results still robust in the EU market.
Thank you. Yes, so I think we have at least 2 questions, but we'll take them one at a time.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. So the first, how you measure RRI, so your main variable of interest, that was not very clear for me from the presentation. And second, I think Stephen and Gina with co-authors have another paper where they show the opposite result. And I'm not very clear what is the difference. Maybe it's different markets, countries, so it would be good if you clarify this. And the other point, that's my comment on the breaking in different periods, maybe you could consider either Paris Agreement, so 2015, or maybe Trump era and no Trump era. So this could be some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And your suggestion very helpful. Let me explain one by one. About the first, our X in my model is the RRI. It's a ESG risk exposure provided by risk database, so which measures the firm's ESG risk exposure. The higher RRI, the higher ESG risk exposure, and the lower ESG performance. And the Y in our model is just the proportion of the total back debt divided by the total debt, and also it's proxied by the total public bond debt divided by the total debt. About your second question, yes, Stephen has another paper related to this area, but yes, in our paper we explained why we have the different result with another paper. Because this is because the big banks probably have the they have the different like shape. So, sorry, probably because this reason our paper just focused on the firm level. Probably big banks and the small banks, they have the different attitude towards ESG risk exposure. So this reason why our results are different with their paper. And about the third one is that, yes, we tried to investigate whether the Paris Agreement and the Trump and the exit of the Paris Agreement have impact on our result, but we didn't find any result in my paper. So that's all.
Hi, so thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. I think it's one of the first paper I see on this topic, very interesting. So I have a question regarding the interpretation, somehow also the empirical variables that you use, because so at least in theoretical models, loans and bonds are not treated as substitutes from decision point of view of the firm. So how do you take this into account? For example, do you consider other changes in the supply side of credit, given the growth of the non-bank sector, especially the investment fund one? I mean, I'm more familiar with the European data, but I guess also in the US in the last decades, this has grown quite a lot. And also, what is the potential impact of the QE that has stimulated issuance more in general? So how do you take these things into account? And then another question is whether you can couple this supply from the market with some lower supply of credit from the banks. Do you have any information on banks' constraints, and can you merge this to your granular data? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. About your first question, we controlled the loan supply in our robustness checks. And we find that the loan supply has no impact on our result. And about your second, yes, it would be very interesting if we could expand our sample to merge with the lenders levels characteristics to see whether there's a different result. Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
I also we have one more question. Yes.
Hello.
Hey.
So, yeah, I have a couple of. I think the one on the supply is already done, so I'm going to skip that. So, reading, I felt the discussion didn't. I mean, it looks to me a bit close to the capital structure literature, like the choice of equity, debt financing, and then the choice between different debt financing options. I'm not sure how you relate to that. And then while listening to you, I mean, the literature going from bank-based. Market-based financial system, like Levine type of literature, like 20 years ago, where they look at growth outcomes, right? So you can even, I think easily you can even flip what you do, saying whether your debt structure options can determine whether you are risky in terms of ESG or less risky. So that's a bit my thought. So the question is, did you have any discussion there, or how do you think about the literature on capital structure? Do you relate to that? And the second was, do you think it's the opposite relationship, whether your debt structure actually would determine your outcome?
Well, thanks for your question about the capital structure. Since in this paper, we just focused on the debt choice, so there's only one, only one main financing sources for firms, right? There's public bond and bank loans. So in this paper, we didn't consider the equity. But I think you are right. Probably in our future, work, probably we could just put the equity in our research to see whether how firms to balance the bank debt, bond debt, and equity financing. So that would be very interesting. Thank you very much. And yes, so about your second question, I'm a little bit confused. Could you please just explain again?
Yeah, it's a more conceptual thing. So I've come from market-based versus bank-based literature, where there it's Levine, right? R. Levine, where you see whether this affects growth outcomes at the country level. And that to me looks a bit the flip side of your equation. So what makes you think is not the other way around than, so whether your debt option determines whether you are high or low risk. So I wanted to see how you think about that.
Oh, well, just we think that in our model that we controlled many other financial characteristics, including the credit risk and many other characteristics. I think we have controlled the other risks. So I don't think it would have impact on our result. That's all. So if
But on this, I'm also a little bit confused on the paper on this, because I think, like Roxandra has pointed out, the ESG ratings, I think we also discussed in the previous setting about ESG ratings in terms of that they can be time inconsistent and so forth taking place. In terms of the effects that we are finding, just one example, in your table, in table 2, you quite usefully kind of show the correlations between the reputational risk index and for instance firm size, and there you find that larger firms tend to have more reputational risk, which I personally would find a little bit surprising in the sense that I would expect that they're using a little bit more emphasis on this. So there may be some element that there are some firms that are there, but in terms of understanding this, and then at the same time we also know that the larger firms are the ones that tend to go for more direct debt issuance into the market in terms of these colors. And I see that you're making the attempts to kind of correct for this, but there seems to be quite a lot of effects going on, which makes it quite difficult to kind of disentangle everything in terms of what you're doing, which is why everything seems to be hinging very much on the reputational risk index that you're using, and also seeing if the results hold for other kind of ESG indicators. I think that would be quite useful in order to understand the robustness of the results, to be honest.
okay, thank you very much.